Somehow, thinking about cybersecurity brings to mind some rogue actors, some sitting by their computers in very remote places, probably some kind of nasty gadget around spying on us, or a hacker obtaining unauthorized access to data. What we tend to forget is that plenty of the data we use, beginning with GPS and ending with the data streams that run through satellites, depend on the security of the infrastructure that we have placed high above the Earth, and asymmetric attacks have not been, to say the least, unknown. As the stars are already out on the sky, at least above our slice on the Earth, let's now plunge into the last panel for today and explore the stars, cybersecurity of outer space, and exploring the unexplored, with Carine Claeys, UE Special Envoy for Space and head of the Space Task Force EEAS, Sarah Brown, Senior Scientist at the Capability Development Branch of NATO's Cybersecurity Center, Kfir Damari, co-founder of Space IL, Robert Spalding, Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute, and Senior Director for Strategy in President Trump Administration 2017-2018, and the host, His Excellency Ambassador Sorin Ducaru, Director of the European Union Satellite Center, that is SatCen, and Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges, NATO 2013-2017.
Hello, I'm really uh, deeply honored and pleased to be hosting and moderating this very special panel dedicated to the cybersecurity of outer space. I will start from the very beginning in pointing to the fact that there is a lot of intertwining between these two spaces and a lot of synergies and complementarities, of course, between cyberspace and outer space. And I had the special, chance to be working for about 4 years at NATO on cyberspace aspects, of course, or also other issues, and now much more involved with outer space aspects. The I think there's also important to bear in mind that both these spaces are actually important enablers in terms of security for the other domains of air, land, and sea. Now, NATO has recently declared outer space as an operational domain. This was 2018 at the London Summit. I recall that a couple of years ago, cyberspace also summit was declared as an operational domain. The important aspect is to bear in mind how these two domains are key enablers for all the others. And frankly, cyberspace is also an enabler for outer space because our assets in space depend on these IT. They are actually outer space computers processing high value data and enabling so many civilian and military activities. So the question of cybersecurity for outer space is a very relevant one. And what comes immediately to mind is whether the normal approach that we would take on cybersecurity on a, let's say, a broad base in the other domains is enough, or whether there should be some special approach, some special prioritization relating in relation to the cybersecurity of space assets. And I think that this discussion will really highlight commonality aspects, but also some of the specificities of measures that have to be taken. And what I would anticipate is that this stellar team of panelists, to use a space metaphor, but it's not just a metaphor, because I had the chance to follow some of the work of members of the panel. So this stellar team, I would expect to address both technical aspects, best practices, the resilience aspects, but also policy considerations, recommendations, aspects related to norms, regulatory frameworks, policy regimes of responsible behavior in space and cyberspace in order to address this issue. And I would, the plan is to give each panelist about 10, 12 minutes to make their presentations from the perspective of their expertise and experience. And afterwards, I would open it for a discussion with those who would raise relevant questions. I have some questions of my own, and let me go directly to the first panelist. One with whom I work very closely, and we shared almost the whole afternoon yesterday in the Schuman area. And this is Carine Claeys, the EU Special Envoy for Space and head of the Space Task Force in the European External Action Service. And I don't want to take too much of the thunder, I recall that about exactly 1 year ago, launched in one of the space conference an EU initiative on the security, sustainability, and safety of outer space, the 3SOS. I'm sure Carine will be able to explain more on this and other priorities of the European Union in this field, and of course, link them with the priority that should be given to the cyber security of space assets in order to eliminate an important element of vulnerability. With this, dear Carine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sorin. Do you hear me, or does the panel hear me? Yes, it seems to work. Okay. So I would first like to beg your indulgence and the indulgence of this distinguished panel, because I'm not at all a cyber expert, and I might therefore not answer some of the very specific questions that you might have on cyber. I'll try and give you a broader overview from my experience in the space and security domain since the beginning of this century. To start with, what do we already have in place, essentially in the multilateral regulatory framework? 2019 has been a key year in outer space. Negotiation in the UN shed some light on multilateral cooperation in space with the adoption by COPUOS of 21 long-term sustainability guidelines for the peaceful use of outer space. Nothing specifically related to threats related to electronic and cyber capabilities, but indirect encouragement through the policy and regulatory framework for space activities. This year has also seen an important initiative from the UK in the framework of the UNGA First Committee, where the UK presents a draft resolution for reducing space threats through responsible behavior. On the cyber front also, am I told by my cyber colleagues, the EU and its member states are promoting the rule-based international order, effective multilateralism, and effective global governance. The international order is geared to based on three main pillars. First, international law applies to cyberspace. It is the indispensable basis for anything else. Second, development of norms of responsible state behavior. And I'll come back to that on that very important aspect. Third, capacity building as a means to strengthen global resilience in an increasingly interconnected world. And as you said, Sorin, not only on the Earth, but also going to the sky, the space, the stars. The EU and its member states strongly support, directly or indirectly, the development of skills and capacity to address cyber threats adequately. Let me come back to the crucial goal of responsible space behavior. 2015 saw the consensual agreement of a set of norms. Confidence-building measures have been developed regionally, also in the OSCE framework, and also the Organization of American States and the Asian Regional Forum. In the UN framework, work is ongoing on the 6th UN Group of Governmental Experts and the UN Open-Ended Working Group on ICTs in the context of international security. It is indeed crucial to strengthen international cooperation towards a global, open, stable, peaceful, and secure cyberspace, where human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law fully apply. In this context, the EU is highly concerned about the efforts of some non-like-minded states, shall I call them, to challenge this approach nationally as well as within the UN. And we see the same pattern for ICT cyber and for space. There is an increased awareness regarding threats to or through space systems worldwide, and the Western world has reacted accordingly. In the US, with the adoption of SPD-4 and the setting up of the Space Force, and very recently with the adoption of SPD-5 on cybersecurity for space system. In NATO, with the adoption of a space policy and the acknowledgement of space as an operational domain. In some EU member states, with the adoption of space defense strategies or security policies for space. And also at the EU level, we think operational. Of course, not in a military way, as do our friends from a few miles away in NATO. However, security and risk management is an integral part of the operation of any space system, including those under civil control. It is important to have an international highway code, of course. It is equally important to ensure that the cars are equipped with functioning brakes and other technical means. When the legal, regulatory, and technical frameworks are in place, it is also crucial to be ready to answer any threat coming from a drunk driver or any other unexpected or malicious conduct. Malicious activities in cyberspace can lead to destabilizing and cascading effects with enhanced risks of conflicts. In other words, it presents risks to peace and security. This is also of concern from the perspective of our economic competitiveness, security and democracy, as well as the integrity of our services. Let me focus on Galileo, the European Global System for Positioning, Navigation, Timing. The first step for Galileo, like for any other space program, is a comprehensive risk management exercised by the program itself. Identification of the threats, analysis and reduction of the vulnerabilities, the usual virtuous cycle of risk management, leading to the unavoidable acceptance of some residual risks. For managing those residual risks, there is a specific Council decision at European level. Council Decision 2014-496 CFSP. This is a Council decision on aspects of the deployment, operation and use of the European Global Navigation Satellite System affecting the security of the European Union. It puts the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security in charge of the operational security-related crisis management for Galileo. As a direct result, the EEAS nominated a Special Envoy for Space in 2015 and set up the Space Task Force, and this is the reason why I'm talking to you today. My team's daily work consists in maintaining situational awareness of the Galileo system, of developing procedures to be ready whenever a threat would concretize, and of exercising crisis management with all the stakeholders. There are specific procedures acting on the Galileo system itself to react to a threat. I can tell you back in 2004, when the Council of the EU adopted the first joint action to tackle the issue of the threats and the residual risks on Galileo, the cyber risk was considered marginal. Without surprise, this is not the case anymore. Since 2017, the EU has put in place a comprehensive cyber diplomacy toolbox to prevent, deter, and respond to malicious behavior in cyberspace. One of its tools is the EU autonomous cyber sanctions regime, adopted last year, which makes it possible to apply restrictive measures to persons and entities involved in significant cyber attacks threatening the EU or its member states, regardless of nationality or location of the perpetrator. On the 30th of July this year, for the very first time, the EU has decided to make use of this sanction regime by imposing travel bans and assets freeze against individuals and entities involved in significant cyber attacks or attempted cyber attacks against the EU and its member states. These targeted measures will ensure that those individuals and entities are made accountable for their actions. So we have frameworks and the capabilities to respond effectively when it comes to cyber threats against our critical infrastructure. You asked where we see room for improvement also. A takeaway, or let us say a learning from our exercises with regard to space, is that we see still room for improvement. Essentially, when it comes to the protection of our common space program, relating to the point of sharing relevant information between member states. I'd like to take this opportunity to encourage member states to reach out towards building a closer community of trust and to collaborate on space matters also for security and defense. I'm fully aware that these are matters of national security and therefore sovereignty. However, we have space assets in common, the infrastructure is shared, and so are the vulnerabilities, which can lead to risks threatening each and every member state and their citizens. We are a team, Team Europe, with common benefits, but also with shared responsibilities. We are currently at a key point in time. The Council of the EU and the European Parliament are about to adopt a new comprehensive space program, grouping the former programs and initiatives. I already named Galileo, also EGNOS, our augmentation system, Copernicus, the biggest Earth observation system in the world, the space situational awareness with the SST initiative, and GovSatcom. This new comprehensive space program will also harmonize the security governance of all those components. In parallel, the Council intends to extend the scope of CD496, that particular decision I spoke about, on threats to or through the European GNSS, to all the components of the new EU space program that are considered security sensitive. And more than ever, a collective approach is needed in order to maintain and improve the EU threat response capabilities. We have to keep pace with an increasingly complex threat landscape, which will not only consist of isolated cyber campaign, but also hybrid scenarios below the threshold of a real crisis that might seek to exploit any internal weakness. The measures already in place do not exclude that we have to progress on our capabilities to defend our common values and our common infrastructure, something that is widely recognized. These measures should send a strong message to the world that we will not tolerate attacks, that we have the tools to protect ourselves and have the resolution to use them. Also, in case of a significant cyber attack against the European GNSS or other EU space systems. Furthermore, the EU should develop strategic autonomy and serve as a security and resilience provider. Enhancing the EU's capability with regard to space-related security and defense is a particularly important aspect when it comes to protecting not only our common space assets, but also the EU, its member states and their citizens. With an integrated approach to security, but also to stability, sustainability, and safety, we aim for a stronger Europe with stronger security and defense capabilities, which can in turn also strengthen NATO. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carine. I could not have hoped for a more comprehensive scene setter intervention, because you indeed made the link not just between the security of space and cybersecurity, but also the link between European initiatives, the framework within the UN. So this was absolutely great. Thank you very much. I will now pass immediately the floor to Ms. Sarah Brown, Senior Scientist for Cybersecurity Service Line at the NCIA, the NATO Communication Information Agency, to bring the NATO perspective to this very interesting topic. Ms. Brown, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. My name is Sarah Brown. I work in the Capability Development Team at NCIA, the NATO Communication and Information Agency, where the Cybersecurity Center for NATO is located. In my presentation today, I want to focus on the fact that national space-based systems are critical infrastructure systems. They're relied on by both nations and NATO for military and commercial purposes. NATO relies on the systems from member nations for key data and also for services that support NATO missions and operations across the air, land, cyber, and sea domains. And so the criticality of these systems for NATO's operations and the technical information that they carry certainly makes space systems attractive targets for adversaries. There are 6 space-dependent capabilities that are used by NATO. First, positioning, timing, and navigation, which includes GPS. Intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance for providing information and imagery about specific targets. Missile defense, which is used to identify and project the trajectory of an incoming missile. communications to support strategic, operational, and tactical planning and decision-making, space situational awareness for information on natural and man-made objects and to ensure physical safety in space, and then environmental monitoring, so providing weather forecasting to support mission planning during peacetime and in conflict. And there are various real-world examples of attacks on these systems, from real-world examples of Russia jamming GPS signals in the 2018 NATO Trident Juncture exercise, as well as in various 2017 training exercises. And then on the other hand, we have published proof of concepts that show how to attack satellite communication systems. So it makes clear the vulnerabilities that exist in today's space systems and the interest from nation states to compromise space assets. And so this underscores the fact that national critical space systems, they need to be strengthened and they need to be made resilient to cyber threats. So our dependence on space for communications and situational awareness activities, combined with the increasing geopolitical tensions, that translates to an ever-increasing threat of attack on the systems. So nation states may be motivated to conduct attacks on these space systems, and it's for a variety of reasons that fall into the categories of sabotage and espionage. So in sabotage, the attackers may be interested in disrupting or destroying the networks that serve as critical infrastructure for nations and NATO. And the cost from that type of attack can be enormous from both a financial and a physical perspective. On the other hand, in espionage attacks, attackers may be motivated to steal information either for an industrial purpose, focused on stealing R&D plans or strategy documents for a commercial advantage, or for a political reason, focused on getting access to sensitive diplomatic intelligence or military technology. And as was mentioned in the previous presentation, space systems in the past have been seen as being relatively safe from cyber threats, in that they have unique hardware and software that's not susceptible to common malware, that they use communications that are only with protected ground infrastructure that's air-gapped from the internet, that they have no realistic physical access once launched, that they are developed by cleared defense contractors that only work on systems to be used in military uses, and that they have military strength encryption on the uplinks and the downlinks. And so due to these factors, cyber concerns have historically focused mostly on electronic warfare threats like jamming, spoofing, or replay attacks. But the same arguments that were made about closed supply chains, unique embedded hardware and software, air-gapped systems, and physical protections were made in the past about industrial control system, ICS environments, until Stuxnet demonstrated how wrong those assumptions were. The avenues for cyber attack for space systems have been found in ground station terminals that provide a direct link to a satellite but are not protected by strong authentication, or are running software that's not regularly patched or upgraded. Avenues for attack also exist in newer satellites themselves that are more often using software-defined functionality for reprogramming in orbit. Another avenue of attack lies in the supply chain for satellite components and the manner in which they integrate. They're very complex systems, satellites, and the components are provided by an increasing number of suppliers, both public and private. Each supplier needs to be validated as a trusted supplier for a national critical infrastructure program. And then once delivered, components must be integrated in a way that a compromise on one component does not lead to a compromise of the entire system. Another area of vulnerability lies in the increasing number of satellite data exchange interfaces that are used between the military and civil sectors for applications such as GPS. The existence of dual-purpose technologies bring in a risk that they can be claimed by attackers to be legitimate military targets. So these challenges are being recognized, leading some satellite companies to claim that they are now spending more money on cyber protection than they are on satellite operations. And certainly given the reliance on space systems, budgets for cyber resilience for these systems should be an extremely high priority. NATO does not own space assets. From its position relying on the services and systems from member nations with space-based assets, it's in an ideal position to encourage mature policy, best practices, and standards that ensure a minimum level of cyber maturity across NATO in the space domain. So one useful guide in this regard is the recently released US cybersecurity policy for space systems. Space Policy Directive 5 provides the following key principles that will be followed by Department of Homeland Security and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which are responsible for enhancing the US cyber defense systems in space. And those are hardware and software for space systems should be developed and operated using a risk-based cybersecurity informed engineering approach. Also, operators or automated control center systems must be able to retain or recover positive control of space vehicles and verify the integrity, confidentiality, and availability of critical functions. Then cybersecurity requirements and regulations should leverage widely adopted best practices of norms and behaviors. Space system owners and operators should collaborate to promote the development of best practices and mitigations to the extent permitted by law and regulation. And finally, space system security requirements should manage the appropriate risk tolerances and minimize undue burden to civil and commercial partners. And so with those key principles, I would like to conclude with some points that I think could be considered by NATO to support a mature cybersecurity environment for outer space. First, with traditional IT networks, a defense in-depth strategy that touches on the supply chain, security controls on each part of the system, of the architecture, the space, the ground, the link, and the user, software development, intrusion detection, and staff awareness are all key areas where cybersecurity controls must be applied and that are key for this critical infrastructure sector. So NATO could encourage nations to commit to developing standards and guidelines in each of these areas, coordinating with leading space organizations and standards bodies, such as in the US, DHS, the CISA, and the US NIST. Second, while NATO is not putting up any satellites right now, NATO can choose to diversify where it gets its space services in terms of suppliers, orbits, and types of technologies. Third, NATO and nations must be proactive in understanding technical threats to space systems, from the denial of service to data loss and malicious data corruption and exfiltration. In the traditional IT environment, a threat-informed defense program is essential to proactively protecting and defending against cyber threats. The MITRE ATT&CK framework has emerged as a very powerful approach to this problem because it provides a detailed categorization of the tactics, techniques, and procedures that are used by the most sophisticated attacker groups operating today. This is a very useful resource for both red teams and blue teams. Pen testers can emulate the behavior of an attack and engagement to represent real-world scenarios and help their customers determine the effectiveness of defensive countermeasures. There are specialized attack frameworks for mobile and ICS environments, so NATO could advocate for the private and public space community to take a similar approach and have the development of a specialized attack framework for space environments. And my final recommendation would be to support the previous recommendation of an attack framework. Another very successful model to facilitate and maintain timely and relevant information sharing on threats and mitigation measures in the field of IT security is the ISAC model. So sector-specific information sharing and analysis centers help critical infrastructure owners and operators protect their facilities, personnel, and customers from cyber and physical security threats. They collect, analyze, disseminate threat information to their members and provide members with the tools to mitigate risks and enhance resilience. So a public-private partnership in the form of an ISAC for the space community would be a mechanism to foster sharing of threats as well as best practices, and this would collectively bring mature cybersecurity practices to the space domain. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Brown, for this comprehensive diagnosis of the challenges and risks, but also for the very thorough approach by NATO in terms of strengthening resilience, establishing standards to be followed by member states. I would not have expected anything else. And also thank you for the very important implementing role that the agency and CIA has both with regard to the domain, outer space, but also cyberspace domains. And I will take the opportunity to send my best regards to Kevin Shai, the head of NCIA, and Jan West, the head of cybersecurity. who are all collaborators. Let me now turn and give the floor to Mr. Kfir Damari, co-founder of SpaceL, to bring his perspective, which is this time one uh, beyond the governmental or intergovernmental one, something that also makes the connection with the private sector and industry. Mr. Damari, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, the previous speakers, I think, gave the basis for this conversation. A lot of the notes that I wanted to speak about are there. So I really will use this opportunity to speak about my personal special envoy. And I'm one of the founders of SpaceL, the first private organization to ever reach the moon. We're a private nonprofit, but my background is not in space, it's in cybersecurity. I was in the Israeli intelligence forces and founded a few companies in cybersecurity. So in a way, I'm wearing both hats. And I will use this opportunity to speak about this the space industry. And I would even say the new space industry and space entrepreneurs. And when we're looking about the subject of cybersecurity through those eyes, I would say it's completely different, maybe not completely, but really different from the way you would look at it as a nation, as a state. And I would say that we are a private nonprofit. We've built a spacecraft, but we are not the only examples. You have today other organizations that build satellites. You have in Israel even high schools that are building satellites. And although, for SpaceIL, I can say because of my background and because, we did work with a few industries, we had high security, cybersecurity standards. But I can tell you that for many companies, for many startups, working in space industry is hard enough. And now thinking about investing more efforts and more money eventually in getting both components and processes and like using all the standards that they should use in order to be protected from cyber attacks. I think this is the last thing they have in their minds. But if I'm wearing my cybersecurity hat, I would say that it's crucial. Now that you have more and more assets that are in space that are not governmental, that you have them managed by high school students or by private companies, private individuals, maybe also in the future. And I think that when you're getting to that point, we will need to see the regulation that some of that was mentioned before, that will make sure that all those assets and all those systems will be protected. I can tell you that on another aspect that, I think that every company, every organization that is working in space is also more interesting for attackers. Now, when I'm talking about attackers, I'm talking both about nation state attackers and non-nation state attackers. And I can tell you that in SpaceIL, we had to tackle a few attacks from both this, from all these options. So I think that attackers realize that there's a high potential for them to be able to get access to assets that are running by new space companies. And maybe it's just the beginning, but I think that as time will move forward, we will actually see these kind of attacks happen. And I do think that, raising this awareness, not just for the government assets, but also for those new space assets that are getting into space, is something crucial. And I will mention a few other things. I will mention, Sarah also mentioned the fact that, we're working in an air-gapped environment, and this gets a lot of people to think that we're safe and not to use the best cybersecurity practices that we should. But now you need to realize that also air gap is not something that just nation state can attack. Also private organizations that that want to do malicious things. It can be from, it can be even in the future to take down competitors. That's something that could be in the future. And the fact that we're air-gapped is not protecting us. Another interesting thing that we need to realize, it's not just, first of all, it's not just satellites. It's also about deep space. We're the first to build a private spacecraft, but you will see more organization going into deep space in the futures. But it's also a lot about the services that are running on the systems that need to be protected. It's not just the system themselves. You need to make sure that it's not just the supply chain, and I'll say something about that, but also you need to make sure that you can protect all the different services that are running on those satellites. Now, if we're connecting this to the supply chain, and when we're talking about new space, and we're talking about consumer off-the-shelf component, and I can tell you as an entrepreneur, a lot of times you're trying to find the cheapest things you can buy that will function. And when we're doing that, sometimes you're not taking the best secured and best tested components. So again, in Space IL, because of our background, we were thinking a bit differently. But I can tell you that in different space startups, you're trying to do your best with the money you have, and this gets you to actually use things that were not tested properly. And this is something that also should be mentioned, that the standards are not for the end systems. It's also for all the different components that are being used in the process. So I talked a lot about the problems. So what can we do in the solution part? So first of all, I will say that in Israel, we have a strong cyber expertise, but we also have strong space expertise. And I can tell you that we are working in connecting those two and creating more startups that can actually tackle and build a mechanism to protect assets in space. So there's a lot of effort both by the Israeli Space Agency, both by the Israeli Cyber Authority, National Cyber Authority, and they're working together to make sure that you will use this expertise to build more tools that can use not just by Israel, but everyone around the world. I will say that I urge space entrepreneurs to think about this. Personally, even now we're working, maybe we don't have a SOC for ourselves. We're working with an external company, MSSP, called Confidesk to run our SOC. But you should think about this. You should make sure that you will do whatever is possible to protect your systems, not just for yourself, but also to make sure that you will be able to protect other assets and not harm other assets that are in space. And on a general perspective, I would say that, again, as a space entrepreneur, I would not want to have the regulation, but on my cybersecurity hat, I believe that this regulation must get also to those private endeavors. And I think one of the crucial things we can do is not just create awareness, but to educate this new industry and make them realize from the moment they start that cybersecurity is something that they have to have in their minds all along. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for this, Mr. Damari, for this perspective and strong link with the private sector approach, the concerns, the risks that have to be taken into consideration, and also bringing this dilemma of, on the one hand, desiring to be free and non-regulated, but on the other hand, understanding that a level of standards and norms and regulation is of benefit for everyone. I will now like to move to and pass the floor to retired Brigadier General Robert Spalding, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and former senior director for strategy in the Trump administration. Let me also mention that the Hudson Institute has a great tradition of making the link between impact of technologies upon strategy and I, as somebody who had the chance to be on a sabbatical and be a non-resident senior fellow in Hudson, I always appreciated high level of expertise and analysis coming from Hudson Institute. With this, General Spalding, I would pass the floor to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I think there are a number of issues that are going on today in space, and particularly where the United States is concerned. So there was an increasing recognition of the militarization of space, and certainly an understanding that a lot of the legacy assets that are on orbit today were not designed with cybersecurity principles in mind. To that effect, the administration recently put forth a Space Policy Directive 5, which really mandates that space systems are designed with cybersecurity in mind. Now, that's not going to help the on-orbit assets, so it's something that we're going to continue to have to deal with as they're continue to be used. The access to those systems and to future systems that get put up on orbit, in the safe and secure use of that and the data that's involved are also a consideration when you understand that there's an increased commercialization, really a democratization of access to space for data usage, and a host of other issues. On the commercialization of the data, there's an increasing effort to use advanced computing and advanced networking on space, so software-defined networking and advanced high-performance computing to deal with all of the sensor data that's being collected in space, and then providing timely alerts to those interested in the outcomes of that processing. In this too, there's enormous challenges with regard to cybersecurity, and that was what the SPD5 was really focusing on, is the need to, from the very beginning of designing space systems, to consider cybersecurity. And I think as we see the increased democratization of the space, and understand that in addition to that, we have an increasing in the United States effort to continue our manned spaceflight programs, which bring a level of risk not just to folks on the ground for cybersecurity that creates a risk for on-orbit platforms, but also for people that are transiting orbit, going to other celestial bodies like the moon or like Mars, also creates a risk for those platforms. So there's a number of issues where there's an increasing recognition that space is going to be a much more crowded place. Data is going to feature heavily in space, and the need to ensure that the systems and the data is all kept secure are part of the fabric of the 21st century. And really, if you understand the competitions and potentially the conflicts that as we go forward in the world, it's going to be much more focused on data and economic and information, and the nexus between all three of those. And space plays an enormous role in that. And so from a commercial perspective for the United States, it is an incredibly important industry for the United States and really for the nations of the world. And so I think the great thing about the advanced efforts of commercial space companies to really, advance this democratization of space is the ability for not just governments but individuals to recognize innovation and promote new ways of accessing space, but also providing the outcomes of that access to people in different ways that increases the not only their ability to access innovation in space, but also to provide new use cases and applications here on the ground. So space is an incredibly dynamic future going forward. And in order to ensure that future is accessible and doesn't provide risk to either individuals on the ground or individuals in space or systems in space that we depend on for critical infrastructure, we're going to have to ensure that cybersecurity features heavily in that. And to date, we have designed systems to be cyber secure from the outside. In other words, we haven't thought about the implications of being connected to a global network on the initial design. And of course, this is where SPD5 is going. This is where the new Space Command in the United States is going. And this is really where the world needs to go in terms of promoting a safe and effective and efficient use of space for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John Spalding, for your perspective. I mean, these were really very thoughtful and deep analysis that generated a huge contribution to the subject matter. Let me ask if any of you would like to raise any question to each other, given the different backgrounds, experiences, and focus areas, because I think we really had a great complementarity in this panel. So is there anyone that would like to raise a question to any of the colleague panelists? If not, let me raise a question, if I may, and that is related to an important point made by Carine Claeys about the need to have a regime of responsible behavior and norms and regulations. And my question is there any clear trend now among nation states recognizing the, I would say, degree of the challenges in space, including coming from cyberspace, that would, I would say, generate hopefully a faster pace in terms of mutual understanding and mutual agreed approaches to create more stability and security in space. Mr. Damari mentioned the fact that the private sector realizes the need of some degree of regulation in order that so that the environment becomes or remains workable. How about the approach by member states, by the international community? How is it compared to, let's say, a couple of years ago, also given your long-standing experience in this field?
If I may, Sorin, I think that there starts to be some understanding, but the process is very, very slow. As I mentioned, there still is a big lack of confidence between the various United Nations member states, so at the worldwide level. And this is one of the reasons why the EU has launched last year, as you mentioned, the 3SOS initiative, going for safety, security, and sustainability of outer space and outer space activities, but also thrice SOS, 3 times it is urgent to act. And this is not only for safety reasons, but also for security reasons. It is an important element, and it is very important to have the whole world community on board on defining the rules of the game that would be acceptable to all. I think that we still have quite a lot of efforts to make in order to have everyone around the table. We, for the moment, in the UN are around the table, but still not always listening to each other. And this is the next step, is to allow us to not only be around the table, but listen to each other. We still need to go forward. And I think that the UK initiative of this draft resolution, by the way, already sponsored by some EU member states, to enhance confidence in order to avoid and put it very clearly, to avoid an arms race in outer space, and to increase mutual confidence.
Excuse me, can we ask you for...
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carine, for your straightforward answer, explaining also the political dynamics in the UN system on this. And thank you for the effort that you're doing and the EU is doing in, I would say, providing some incentives and also some mechanisms like the 3SOS initiative to stimulate this cooperation and the effort to work together for a regime that would ensure stability, safety, and security in space. If I am allowed just one other item to raise before closing this panel, because I know we have been running out of time. This is the issue of the supply chain security. I think it was mentioned by
Spalding.
Thank you for being a loyal member of the Marriott Vacations Club.
I'm sorry? I think I had an intervention. So my point is the following: given the fact that we see a gold rush in terms of space technologies, and also a run towards the most cost-efficient options, as Mr. Damari has highlighted. What can we do so that we don't repeat some of the mistakes, for example, from the cyber domain, of not taking care enough of the sources of components or of sub items, part of the more sophisticated systems. What have we learned? What can we learn? And what should be the higher level approach, especially since we're speaking about supply chain for space systems, both in terms of their IT part, but also in terms of their other components that have to do with the characteristics of space assets. Anyone would like to bring some special accents on this? How should we do it differently this time, because there's so much at stake?
I can offer an answer on this one. I would say that one thing that is important for space organizations, space providers to understand is the risk of an insecure system and the threats that are targeting these systems, and then the decision to take time to invest more time and potentially more money into securing those systems or working with secure providers becomes clear, because the alternative cost of designing the insecure systems is far worse. So I think it's a similar approach that the IT security community has had to take, is to raise the understanding of the risk of not taking the time to prioritize security that's needed in the space community. It's a culture and mindset change that's needed.
So
If
we
I-
need
if I
an
may-
awareness campaign to highlight this risk. I take it from your intervention, Madam Spalding. It would be useful to have an awareness campaign towards both industrial providers and also government regulators. But Mr. Damari, you wanted to intervene, please.
Yes, I wanted to say, again, it's awareness, it's education, but I think it's also, in the other hand, creating those standards. And, SPD5 was mentioned, and just creating the awareness, not just for the startups, but that are building those new type of systems, but creating this awareness to the whole supply chain, that all of the different companies that will work in order to create those different components will have the understanding about the impact that can happen if they won't work in the right standards.
Thank you. And actually, General Spalding was mentioning some of the efforts on this path on the US side. And I also know that NATO has a really great experience and tradition on standards, the famous STANAGs that come from the conventional, let's say, military domains. I think could be something that should be taken as a model for these other domains, space and cyberspace.
Please
Ladies
be
and
wrapping
gentlemen,
up.
thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. I don't know if you have more times. I need to pass the floor to the organizers while thanking you deeply for what I thought was a very, very interesting and thoughtful discussion. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We would like to thank very cordially the participants in this panel and all the people who have shared their knowledge with us yesterday and today. There have been an awful lot of you, and you have certainly given us plenty of food for thought and let us understand questions of cybersecurity better.